Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fifth week of our course on drugs and behavior. So this week we'll be talking about drug policy and drug regulation. Last week we covered drug use and its impact on society and the individual and the interaction between the two. And now we'll talk more about the legal status of drugs. So what we're going to do is look at drug regulations really in the United States. So we talked some about the history of drugs, certainly in the ancient world, in our first week. And now we'll be focusing on the United States. Not that other countries didn't have an effect on drugs and drug use in the U.S. So we'll ask what regulations exist, and we'll look over recent history at how laws have evolved over time. We'll also ask not just what laws exist, but what's causing these laws to come into existence? What changes the laws? What affects their enforcement? So looking at these things over time and try and understand something about causes, not just the laws that exist and memorizing lists of rules, but why these laws exist. And sometimes the reasons are good, and sometimes the reasons aren't so good. And we'll talk about all of that. And we'll also talk about enforcement, mainly in the second lecture this week, about methods of enforcement. We'll talk about various agencies that have been responsible for enforcing drug laws. And then in the second lecture, we'll get into how effective those enforcement efforts are and what's difficult about enforcing drug laws. So in this session in particular, we're going to look at the history of drugs in the early portion of the U.S. history. So we've already gone over ancient history. We're not going to go as far back as that. But we'll go over from sort of the beginning of the United States as a country up to the current time. We'll make the break between the two lectures around the 50s, the 1950s. And so we'll see today how laws came into being. At first, there really weren't any, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But look at the history of drugs and drug laws in the U.S. and how those two have affected one another. So looking at the beginning of drug legislation in particular, and we'll see there are a couple laws in early U.S. history, but really things start to gain momentum in the early 1900s. And there's a reason for that time period as well to be the beginning of drug legislation. It's not just that we thought all of a sudden in 1900 that it was a good idea. There were some root causes that preceded that by decades, and we'll understand why that was. We'll also talk about the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and what its role is in regulating drugs. Of course, the FDA didn't always exist. It was something that had to be written into existence, had to be legislated. And we'll see what caused that and what the FDA's job is. So first things first, last week's discussion. As always, it was a good back and forth, I thought. Particularly the disease or not question. So is drug dependence a disease? It's a tough question. And that was borne out by the fact that opinions are really split on this one. And hopefully that's the sign of a good discussion, is that there were probably as many people saying yes as there were saying no. And of course, even your book admits that there are ways in which drug dependence is like a disease and ways in which it isn't. But there were sort of two obvious camps in this discussion. One issue that came up fairly often was the issue of responsibility, and really responsibility for one's actions as a drug user. And many people were of the opinion that if we claim that it's a disease, that absolves people of responsibility for their actions. If somebody commits a crime, in an attempt to obtain more drugs or money for drugs, or is driving under the influence of a drug, if they are dependent on it, does that absolve them of responsibility? And that's an important question. So the issue, and I responded to a post in the discussion, it may not be as simple as black or white. It may not be just, yes, it is a disease, no, it isn't a disease, or yes, the person is completely responsible, or no, they are not responsible at all. There may be a middle ground there, and it may depend on the person's situation. So if someone has a genetic predisposition, they may still be able to avoid taking a drug, but they may not be as able to avoid it as easily as someone who doesn't have a genetic predisposition. So there are obviously a number of factors that influence whether someone takes drugs and whether someone continues to take drugs once they start. Genetic influences, environmental influences, social, parental, and we've talked about all these things already. So it may not be as simple determination as yes, all people are totally responsible, or no, no one is responsible at all. And of course, either one of those decisions has its own set of ramifications. We don't want to stigmatize drug use to such a degree that people won't seek treatment. But we also don't want to say, well, if you're on drugs, it doesn't really matter what happens afterwards. It's not your fault. So it's a tough issue, and people brought up some really excellent points. One thing that was brought up sometimes was non-recreational drug use. And this is, when we talk about drug use, and this issue has come up over the last few weeks, again and again, and it's a prevalent issue when we as Americans talk about drug use, is we tend to say drug use and automatically think of recreational drug use. And of course, that's not the point of this course. We're talking about drug use in all its forms. So when we say that a drug user is responsible or is not responsible for their actions, one thing we have to think about is, are we framing that question just in terms of illicit drug use or recreational drug use? There are a number of people who take psychoactive drugs, not because they're taking them recreationally, but they're taking them to avoid chronic pain or to address a psychiatric disorder. There's lots of reasons to take drugs, and not all of them are for recreational purposes. So then we're even in a grayer area, if you will. So if someone, it's easy to say, well, that person didn't have to start smoking tobacco, or that person didn't need to start smoking marijuana, or that person didn't need to start drinking because these are recreational substances, usually. But now it's trickier if we're talking about pain relieving agents like opioids. So if someone's in chronic pain, is it, to the same degree can we say, well, that person didn't need to start taking that pain relieving agent? Well, yeah, if they wanted to be in excruciating pain for the rest of their lives. But that's qualitatively a very different concept. And it does call into question whether we can make a blanket statement about whether someone's responsible for their own dependence because they opted into the drug use. So that's a hard question. And there is no obvious answer, and that's why the debate, I think, was as lively as it was. The second question was about the media and the perception of drugs and drug use as portrayed by the media. Largely the news. We'll get into non-news sources at the end. One of the main questions is, does it keep people from harm? So the idea is that the media tends to exaggerate negative effects or the frequency of drug use of a particular kind. The argument being, well, if it keeps people from using the dangerous drugs, then is that so bad? Again, there's no obvious answer. That's why I posted it as a discussion question. So if you're of a more utilitarian nature, you might say, well, if it helps everyone on average, maybe it's okay that they exaggerate the claims. If you're more beholden to the idea that the media and should be purveyors of accurate information, then you might not be as comfortable with that idea. You may say, no, they should be more truthful in their reporting. The truth is what matters, not the effects. And this is a centuries, millennia-old argument. Do the ends justify the means? And of course, one issue is, even if it does keep an individual from trying a dangerous drug, if the person later finds out that that report was inaccurate, what does that do to the media's credibility? Maybe that drug wasn't so dangerous, the person finds out about it, and then doesn't believe a later news report about some new drug that actually is dangerous. They go and try the drug. So that's another issue, and it's one people in the media are certainly familiar with. By making a sensational claim about the effects of a drug or how common a drug is, do they hurt their own credibility? And of course, it's not just the news. A few people brought up other media, so popular music and television. And while the media, more often than not, tend to exaggerate the negative effects of a drug, popular media tend to downplay those effects. They can even glorify drug use and make cigarettes, alcohol, whatever whatever drug is being portrayed, make it seem cool or desirable. Um, Convince the viewer that they want to be a part of this group that uses the substance. So it's not just the news media that affect our attitudes about drugs, although the question was framed that way. So the question is, are these practices acceptable? And again, there's no obvious answer. Um, and the opinions are pretty mixed on this one as well. So again, another good week of discussion. Keep it up. As I mentioned in announcements, this coming week, I'm splitting everyone into groups of 4. So as a group, you'll need to decide which question you want to respond to and how you want to respond to it. It'll give you a way of bouncing ideas off one another and having a really coherent response that evaluates all sides of an issue. And you can avoid redundancy with other posts, for example. So anyway, so next week, a little bit of a new system now that everyone's comfortable with the discussion forum. Okay, so talking about the history of drug regulation in the United States. So at first, there really weren't drug regulations. It didn't last very long, at least in economic terms. Well, as we'll see, it took a long time for certain drugs to be off the market. That at first sort of it was a free-for-all, everything was on the market, and there was a trend to, at first, try and make money off the drug trade, and the concerns were more economic than they were for the safety of the patient. So at first there really weren't any drug regulations. We've already talked about the Whiskey Rebellion in our very first week, and this was a result of taxation on alcohol, and in particular on whiskey, which was commonly made, consumed in sort of more rural areas of the burgeoning United States. In fact, it was even used as currency at times. But the Whiskey Rebellion was the result of a whiskey tax, so that the government wanted to make more revenue off of the people that were making whiskey and trading whiskey. So this is an economic motivation. So this is the government, which of course, just after the American Revolution, had a bit of a financial problem. They didn't have as an industrial economy as Europe did, and they were in a pretty big hole budget-wise after spending money on the revolution. So in an effort to recoup these costs, government levied taxes on whiskey, and this led to rebellions. In this picture, you see what is a tax collector being tarred and feathered and ridden out on a rail, all of which are extremely unpleasant experiences, not to mention humiliating. But this was part of the rebellion, and it's what prompted the government to actually send in troops, and it's one of the first examples of the government sending military forces in to enforce laws on its own population. And what we'll see, certainly from the beginning and on into fairly recent history, is that there have been different regulations for legal drugs and illegal drugs. And of course, as I mentioned, illegal drugs are a relatively recent concept. At first, everything was legal. Now, smuggling it in wasn't necessarily legal, but the drug itself was okay through legitimate channels. Your book makes a point of the difference between symbolic and instrumental impact, so I'll mention that briefly here. Symbolic impact are sort of the indirect social consequences, not of the enforcement, but just of support for legislation. So whether the legislation against a drug is enforced at all, regardless of how effective that enforcement is, historically people that support anti-drug legislation are often deemed as being more moral or more upstanding. This is in part a carryover from the moral model of drug use and dependence. Instrumental impact are things that actually result from drug enforcement efforts. So a change in the rates of drug dependence, the change in prison populations, the change in the lives of those enforcing the laws. So those are two different kinds of impact that anti-drug legislation can have. So I just want to make that distinction before we move on. So I started with the Whiskey Rebellion, which is in the late 1700s, and then it's sort of a century more before we see anything really substantive in terms of drug regulation. And so this is a transition from what's called laissez-faire government to a reformist government. And laissez-faire means, literally means sort of let them do as they will. But what it means practically is that the government doesn't interfere with business practices or with individual behavior. So it sort of lets everyone do what they want to a certain degree. And reformism is what we transitioned to in the early 20th century, the idea that we need to impose more moral strictures on businesses, on individuals. And so this change arose from a variety of circumstances. So first, there were a lot of other practices that were being regulated. So the 19th century, the 1800s in America, was a period of industrial revolution. So we had the rise of larger corporations, factories. We saw a transition from almost an entirely agricultural society to an industrial one. We saw more people living in cities. And so what happened was that there really weren't any regulations on business practices and really no enforcement of business ethics. And so there were a number of important pieces of writing and reporting that pointed out that, for example, labor laws were really not existent. So we had companies that were sort of extorting their own workers, and they had their own private police forces that would prevent strikes. So you had the beginning of unions, where the workers actually now had some political power, as opposed to the companies being able to sort of run everything, and if you didn't like it, well, you could lose your job. So there was that. There was regulation in the labor market. There was also regulation in terms of health for things like food processing. So there's a big expose on how slaughterhouses operated, how sanitary the conditions were. The answer is not very. And so regulations are being put in place to protect the average person and to protect their health. There were also changes in society and social structure, and a lot of this was ethnic in origin. You had a lot of immigrants coming in from Europe, certainly, also from Asia. You had a large influx of Chinese immigrants. And of course, with the end of the Civil War in the late 1800s, you also had African American populations that were moving around and now had a new social status. And so for a large portion of society, these were viewed sort of as threats. The society was changing faster than they were perhaps comfortable with. And so we'll see a lot of drug-related behaviors being associated with particular ethnic groups. And this wasn't necessarily true, but that was the motivation behind drug regulation in many cases, because that was something that was used to induce anxiety. If you could associate a drug-related cause, which didn't necessarily inspire much enthusiasm, with a racial distinction or some sort of racial cause, well, now that was something that more people were concerned with. So, for example, one thing that was prevalent coming into the 20th century was the use of opium, which opium originally comes from Central Asia. And we've already talked about in our first lecture about the Opium War and Britain's involvement, and to a certain degree France and even the US being involved in the Opium War and in making this a part of Eastern Asian, primarily Chinese culture, forcing opium imports on China. And then this sort of came back to bite us. We and mainly the British had made opium popular. And so now, not surprisingly, it becomes popular in the US eventually as well. And this was associated with Asian immigrants. Of course, not Asian immigrants weren't the only ones using opium. Also, drugs became purer. So chemistry was beginning to evolve as a discipline. So it was possible to purify morphine from opium. Opium is actually a mixture of different chemicals, and we'll talk about that when we get to opioids. But morphine is very famous, very popular, and it's a natural component of opium. And chemists found a way to purify it. Cocaine, another drug that was purified. So it was originally a naturally occurring product, but through chemistry, we were able to purify it down to its active ingredient, cocaine. So we were getting regulations in other areas of our society. We also had changes in society that some people felt threatened by. We had some drugs that were popular, and the drugs were becoming more potent. And of course, combine all this with the prevalence, the popularity that is, of this sort of moral model of drug use. That those who use drugs, certainly those who became dependent on them, were in some way inferior. They were weak-willed. Um, and so that really contributed to this idea of reformism, that you needed to have laws that governed what was moral in the context of drug use and what wasn't. So moving into the early 1900s, we have a couple of important pieces of legislation. First, we have the 1906 Pure Food and Drugs Act. And as we'll see, drug regulations really sort of evolved one piece of a legislation at a time. And eventually it became this sort of ungainly combination of laws and regulations and policies. It was no longer manageable. And so eventually we sort of started with a clean slate. And then things gradually got more and more complicated again, as we'll see. But there were a number of important pieces of legislation, but no centralized authority, really, and no centralized sense of purpose. So the Pure Food and Drugs Act was really concerned with the labeling of ingredients. So you could no longer misrepresent what was in the medicine that you were marketing. And this was under the jurisdiction of the Department of Agriculture. So food and drugs have always sort of gone hand in hand. They're things we put into our bodies. And drugs oftentimes, certainly early on, were natural products. So it made a certain sense to have this under the agriculture department. And so they were concerned with accurately depicting what was in the medicine or in the drug as it was marketed. Notice they're not making any laws about whether the drug is effective, whether it is safe. It's only whether it is accurately labeled. So it's a very early step. A few years later, there's the long name is not important. It's popularly known as the Harrison Narcotics Act. And here, this was really aimed at opioids and cocaine. And we see here, by way of reminder, heroin is an opioid, but it was also branded as a medicine by the Bayer Company. Heroin is a brand name, as we mentioned before. So this is a medicine that was available as a medicine. It's not as accessible now as it was then. But back then it was labeled as a drug just like aspirin was. So opioids and cocaine were really the targets of the Narcotics Act. And here it's worth mentioning that narcotics is a term that has evolved over decades. Originally, narcotics meant something that puts you to sleep. It's the same root word as narcolepsy. But narcotics eventually just took on this meaning of illegal drugs. So opioids do have sedative properties. Cocaine, of course, is a stimulant. So in its original definition, is not a narcotic. But things like cocaine and marijuana eventually got rolled into this concept of narcotics. Anyway, the idea here was, again, not looking at safety or effectiveness. The idea here was about revenue, looking to stop smuggling, looking to increase revenue for the government. And so the Department of the Treasury was involved in this piece of legislation in terms of enforcing new taxes on opioids, on cocaine. So these were still legal drugs, and they could be obtained through a doctor. But the idea here was that they were taxable. And so if you were smuggling them in, then you were avoiding tax. And so that was the law you were actually breaking. It was not endangering the public in any sense. It was avoiding tax revenue or avoiding paying taxes. So again, we see a totally different department of the government, a totally different aim, for this bit of legislation. Also, the campaign that got this pushed through Congress was, as I mentioned before, sort of racially motivated. Opioids were associated, especially with Asian Americans, and cocaine with African Americans. And neither of these was really had a substantial claim to the truth. So there was sort of a fear-based marketing campaign that fed into everyone's existing biases against these immigrant populations and against minorities. But that was the tack they took because that was a more effective way of getting the laws pushed through. And of course, in 1920, we have the beginning of the Prohibition era. We have the 18th Amendment, which bans the production and distribution of alcohol, except in very small medicinal quantities. We'll get into that when we talk about alcohol in a few weeks. So I'm not going to dwell on it here. But this was really an important piece of legislation because it actually brought up the idea of a prohibited drug. It was illegal in almost all cases. And again, this was largely under the jurisdiction of the Treasury Department, so a lot of it was looked at through sort of an economic lens. Eventually, it was repealed, so it didn't last all that long, but it did provide this concept of banning drugs, of how drug enforcement could be regulated, and so it sort of got the ball rolling in terms of other drug legislation, even though Prohibition itself didn't last all that long. Okay, so also in 1906, we have the establishment of the Food and Drug Administration, also known as the FDA. And that in combination with what's called the Shirley Amendment, which came a few years later, we now have this law regarding accurate claims of content, so labeling. Not necessarily advertising, but labeling on the bottle or the container itself. We've already talked about that in terms of the other 1906 legislation. But what now the FDA was starting to do was, after the Shirley Amendment, was start to look at acceptable levels of safety. So before, it was just whether the claims of the ingredients were accurate. And now the FDA started to worry about whether the drug was safe or not. And also whether the drug was effective or not. So these are new concerns. Before, no regulating agency cared if the drug did anything, and even cared if it was harmful. All they cared about was that it was an accurate reflection, and the attitude was sort of let the buyer beware. The person was responsible for knowing which drugs to ingest and which not to. Once they were labeled, it was sort of out of the government's hands. So with the advent of these new regulations, you had a big effect on what were called patent medicines. And these really had no development process in terms of research. Scientific method had been around for a while, but was only beginning to be brought to bear on medicine, at least in terms of drugs and their effects on the body. So you had a lot of different products that were marketed for a variety of illnesses, disorders, whether they really had an effect on that or not. And this still exists in other countries. You'll have sort of folk remedies that aren't ever evaluated, but are advertised, at least in the bottle, if not in other media, as being effective for certain disorders, diseases. And so the patent medicines were marketed without much regard for the safety of the ingredients, but certainly the effectiveness of the ingredients for what was being claimed the ingredients would do. So this was sort of a big step forward in getting rid of these patent medicines that didn't really do anything. If you've ever heard the term snake oil salesman, it refers to patent medicines. So this is someone who's selling a product that doesn't actually do anything. They're basically hucksters. But they're claiming that their product does confers a benefit on the individual. So the FDA started to put regulations and enforcement on patent medicines. One thing the FDA doesn't do, it doesn't do to this day, is cover dietary supplements. And these are sort of a different category. Whether they should be or not is an issue for debate. But one thing is that dietary supplements uh, can't have certain kind of ingredient. If ingredients have already been established to have psychoactive effects, for example, then they're no longer dietary supplements. These are things like vitamins and other natural products that don't have any proven effect. So that means that the products can't market themselves as curing cancer or curing drug dependence or any other measurable effect. They can say, oh, it improves your well-being in general. So there are restrictions on the claims that these products can make. And they also have to have a disclaimer that say this product has not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. You've probably heard that on TV or seen it on labels. But those are the requirements for dietary supplements. They are not drugs. They have not been evaluated. They don't necessarily do anything. Um, and so they belong to their own category. So something else the FDA does is drug evaluation. But this wasn't something that happened right off the bat. At first, the FDA was really sort of playing catch up. That is, an individual or a company would come up with some remedy, some product, and then begin marketing it. And as long as the ingredients were properly labeled, there was no barrier to the drug being put out on the market. And so in 1938, the FDA had a new requirement for what are called new drug applications. And this was a process that really evaluated the safety before the drug would go to market. So this changed the FDA's role from one of sort of an investigative force, that is, once the drugs were already on the market, the FDA would go and evaluate them. But the drugs, of course, had already been on the market, were making money for the manufacturer, were already potentially harming people. So now this changed the FDA's role to one of a gatekeeper. So it wasn't that these things were already on the market and the FDA was trying to catch up. It was that these things didn't get to the market unless they were approved by the FDA. And then later on in the 60s, so we're already moving up, 50 years from the first drug legislation, now drugs had to get approval before clinical trials in humans could begin. So you can no longer test drugs on human beings without the FDA's approval, much less market them. So this gets us to the idea of clinical trials. And clinical trials are a way of assessing the safety and the effectiveness of a new drug. And remember, safety and effectiveness were relatively new concerns. They've only been around for 40 years or so. So there are three phases in a clinical trial, and this is true today even. So phase one, you take the drug and you give it to healthy people in low doses. This is after we've already tested the drug on animal models. So low doses on healthy people, and this is not to evaluate how effective the drug is. This is to look at how safe it is. So making sure it doesn't produce adverse reactions in healthy people. So if it passes that bar, then phase two is you take a patient group, someone that actually suffers from the disease that the drug is intended to treat. And then you take 100 of those individuals, if 100 are available. There are plenty of diseases that are very rare, and it's hard to get drugs developed for those rare diseases because there's no market for them. There are special laws to deal with that issue. But anyway, a typical phase two clinical trial will take about 100 individuals and test the drugs when they have the disease in question. And so now we're starting to look at safety in a patient population, but also effectiveness. Does the drug cure the disease, or is it at least more effective than previous drugs are at curing the disease? And then phase three is a large study of a patient population. So here we have thousands of individuals, and they have the disease in question. And so now the question is, we're looking for rare but adverse effects, and again, trying to get a better statistical sample of whether those drugs have the effectiveness that we're looking for. So now we have a bigger statistical sample. We can say with more accuracy how effective the drug is. And then eventually what happens is sort of a risk-benefit analysis. How effective is the drug compared to how safe is it? If a drug has the higher potential of unsafe consequences, well, then it had better also be that much more effective. And so there are study groups, that is, groups of doctors and researchers that evaluate how risky the drug is, compare that to how beneficial it is potentially. Okay, so that is it for this session. Next time, I will continue looking at drug policy and regulation. We'll continue moving forward in history. So we sort of ended in the 30s, the 50s, the 60s, and we'll pick up at that point and start looking at what are called controlled substances now, which is not a concept that existed back in that early period. We'll talk about new drug regulations. How have drug laws changed over the last 50 years? And also we'll talk more about enforcement. So how are these laws enforced? How effective are those laws? So these are all issues we'll talk about in the second lecture this week, and I will see you all then.